Well, Jonathan Haidt, we really want to welcome you to the Forum on the Family 2024. There's hundreds of delegates who are very excited about hearing about your book and about your research. Sorry we couldn't get you down here in person, but you've got family priorities as we speak, so that's totally understandable, putting family first. But it's been a whirlwind of a book launch, Jonathan. Can I start, and look, I want to maximise our time, our limited time together. The premise of your book is that we have changed from a play-based childhood to a screen-based childhood. So before we look at the screen, what do you mean by play-based childhood, and when did it end?
So first, Bob, let me say I love New Zealand. I spent about a week and a half with you in New Zealand in 2019. I'd love to come back, but boy, it's just far away. It takes a long time, and I'll come back in a year or two.
Right.
Another thing I loved about New Zealand is that you are the last English-speaking country that lets children climb trees. As far as I can tell, you actually do let children have some freedom, have some risks. So that should be a protective factor. But now to your question. So the way to think about this is that human children have always had a play-based childhood. All mammals play. When I was a kid, I grew up, during a crime wave in the United States, and there were drunk drivers. There were all kinds of threats, but all kids went out. All kids went out to play. That was just obviously what kids do. They play. And in the 1990s, in America and in Britain, we freaked out. We lost trust in each other. We thought everybody's going to sexually abuse our children. There were all these scandals, some real, some fake. And so we began locking up our kids, like, no, you can't go outside because it's too dangerous. You'll be abducted. And that didn't happen in New Zealand or in some of the Scandinavian countries. So there are some parts of the world that didn't lose the play-based childhood in the 80s and 90s the way we did. But then the funny thing is, when the phone-based childhood, so don't focus on screens so much, because of course kids were watching TV a lot before.
Yeah.
It's the phone-based childhood. It's having one of these, a supercomputer connected to the internet that can bring garbage to you. It can bring predators to you. It can bring sextortionists to you. It brings sex and violence to you 24/7. That all sweeps in between 2010 and 2015. It wasn't like that in 2010 or 2009, but by 2015, most of our teens have traded in their flip phones for a smartphone, and now most of their life goes through the phone. They don't go out and play very much. They don't spend much time with other people. They don't enjoy the outdoors. They're really growing up just looking at their phones.
So is helicopter parenting a real thing? We're worried about the safety. I think British sociologist Frank Furedi called it paranoid parenting. So how do we get around this concern for safety, but at the same time allow kids to experiment and sometimes to even injure themselves?
Yeah, that's right. So Frank Furedi has this wonderful book. It's called Paranoid Parenting. And I was surprised to learn that when I read his book, I was surprised to learn that the same things happen in Britain as happened in America, even though Britain didn't have the huge crime wave that we had in America in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. But what Furedi points out is that a variety of factors about modern life made us lose trust in our neighbors. And so, for example, in America, we had very, very high social capital coming out of World War II. My parents' generation, everybody who remembers the war, they became great citizens, or at least by generation. They invested in their communities, they joined clubs, they were pillars of society. We all let our kids out, and if someone's kids were in trouble, someone else would help them. So that's the way it was in all of our countries. That's the way it still is, I think, in Northern Europe and New Zealand, I hope, in a few countries. But we began to lose that, in part because we have smaller families, we're getting richer, we have air conditioning and television, so you're not sitting on the porch anymore, everybody's inside, and you don't have a lot of kids playing in the street anymore. So a lot of things changed with modernity, with changes in family structure. A lot of things changed so that raising a kid becomes the job of just the one or two parents, rather than more sort of the community, the extended family. So all those things mean that we don't trust the world to put our kid out in it. In America, we don't trust our kids to go 2 aisles over in the grocery store. We think if I'm not looking at you, you might get abducted, which is completely absurd. That's never happened, ever. But we just freaked out in the 90s, and we haven't stopped freaking out. So in my book, I'm trying to get people to see, you know what? the physical world is not very dangerous, and it's a lot less dangerous than it was before the 1990s. If you want to keep your kids safe from sexual predators, get them off Instagram and send them out to play.
Yeah. Now, before we get into your latest book, I also know that, I first heard of you when I read The Coddling of the American Mind, how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure, named one of the best books by the New York Times in 2018. Where does The Coddling of the American Mind book fit into all of this? I mean, was that the forewarner to what we're seeing now in terms of an anxious generation?
Yes, that was my first pass at it with Greg Lukianoff. And we were very focused on the university setting because that's where we first saw this. So in 2015, the students coming in 2015 and also 2014, they were very different from students in 2012. We thought they were all millennials. That was our name for the new generation, was the millennial generation. We thought it went from birth year 1981 through birth year 2000. That's what they told us, the demographers told us. Yeah. But it turns out that kids born in 1996 and later are very different. They have much higher levels of anxiety and depression, higher levels of suicide, higher levels of self-harm. They're more fragile, more easily offended, on average. There are plenty of exceptions. And so the Coddling of the American Mind was our attempt to see, how did this happen? And one of the factors was the vast overprotection of children that began in America in the 1980s. Now, when we wrote The Coddling, we knew that it applied in Britain and Canada too. Same story in America, Britain, and Canada. At the time, we didn't know so much about Australia, New Zealand. In general, the worst ideas come from California, and then they head east in the United States. And then our very worst ideas that take over America, then they head east to Europe. And then a few years later, they seem to go to Australia, New Zealand. And we saw that happening. All the terrible things happening on college campuses, the students shouting down speakers, the refusal to let people speak. I think, you've had a number of... You've got that too. You didn't necessarily have that in 2015, 2016 when we did, but in the years after that, I believe you've gotten a lot of it. So there really is an Anglo disease. There's something about the Anglo countries that was very receptive to a set of ideas about victim oppressor mindset. Everything is, good versus evil, victim oppressor. So The Coddling was really all about that. And in that book, we wrote this in 2017, really. We have 2 or 3 paragraphs where we say, now, it could be that social media and smartphones contributed to this because the timing is right. This generation, they got on Instagram and Facebook when they were in middle school, or, here it's age 11 to 13, whereas the millennials, they didn't get on until college. So, maybe social media has something to do with it. We didn't know. That was 2017 because the evidence was not clear in 2017. In 2019, after our book came out, I started studying that in much more detail. And what I learned was horrifying. What I learned was that these incredible increases in anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide are not just in the US and the UK. They're in all the English-speaking countries and in Northern Europe, in all of the freest countries in the world, the countries where children had a lot of freedom to make a life that they wanted. That used to be a recipe for happiness. The Anglo countries and the Nordic countries generally dominated the list of happiest countries over the last 10 or 20 years. But in the Anglos and the Nordics, what we see is the kids who were very rooted in religion or in a conservative family, it's like they were tied down, which is actually good. I'm a big fan of the sociologist Emil Durkheim, who showed us that when people are committed, constrained within a family or religion, they're much less likely to kill themselves. It's easier to find a sense of meaning. So it was especially the secular families, secular children in Western countries that were most at risk in the early 2010s. They're the ones who got washed out to sea from growing up on social media.
Okay, so let's get into the meat of the book, and you've given us a little teaser there. So the premise of the book is that mental health fell off a cliff at the same time in the same way. And you've looked at USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So what is the major finding that you're trying to get through in the book?
The major finding is that we have is that there's not a one factor explanation here, but you can put it all together by saying we messed up the developmental imperative of childhood. Childhood is a long practice for adulthood. Kids are supposed to practice the skills that they'll need as adults. Kittens practice catching mice. Dogs practice catching prey and then fighting over the bones. My puppy loves to bring me her rope bone, and then we play tug of war, and I try to get it from her. We make a big deal. We're fighting over it. It's fun. So she's practicing her dog skills. And human children need to be practicing their human skills. It's a lot of face-to-face stuff, a lot of team versus team competition, sports, gossip, all the stuff that kids need to do a lot of. But what happened, I argue, is that we began overprotecting our children in the real world. We got so afraid of the physical world, so afraid they'd get injured or kidnapped. So we started overprotecting the physical world. We said, no more of that free range stuff. No more of that wandering around outside on your bicycle. What if you're hit by a car? No more of that. You stay home. Oh, and look, here's a computer. It's the 1990s. Computers are coming in. Every family now has some sort of a personal computer. Oh, and it's connected to the internet. You put the phone in, you hear the buzzing, and then you can get information and you can play some games with other kids. It's amazing. And so the millennials who grew up with the early internet, they're fine. Their mental health is fine, and they were a very creative generation. But things changed. The electronic environment really, really changed beginning around 2009. So you get the smartphone introduced in 2007. Before then, everyone had flip phones. Even in 2010, almost all kids had a flip phone or a basic. They didn't have smartphones in 2010. By 2015, they've all got smartphones. In 2010, the smartphone doesn't have a front-facing camera. That is introduced later in 2010. By 2015, almost all teens have a smartphone with a front-facing camera. Now they have high-speed internet, which they didn't usually have in 2010. And so now in 2015, it's possible for a young person to spend 10, 12 hours a day online. They have a supercomputer in their pocket. They're connected to the world, but it's not just that they can be online. It's that now thousands of companies can compete for their attention, send them push notifications. Thousands of men can contact our children and try to exchange photographs with them. Men from all over the world do this. So it's just kind of insane that we said, hey, how about if we give our kids something so that all companies and all men can contact our children anytime they want, and our children can respond without us knowing? How about that? Well, that's what we did, and the results have been terrible.
Okay, and I think that phrase, overprotection in the real world, underprotection in the virtual world, that will strike a chord with many people. In fact, has phone-based childhood and more use of screens, etc., and social media, has that affected boys and girls in the same way?
No, it has not. So the way to think about this is, if you want to trap an animal, you have to use a kind of bait that will be appealing to the animal. So if you want to catch a cat, you should use maybe a piece of fish. You don't use a grape. And the point of a trap is the animal is attracted to the bait, but once they get it, they can't get out. And so how would you trap a girl? How would you trap a 13-year-old girl? You would say, hey, do you want to see what Mary said about Jennifer? Do you want to see what Jennifer said about you? And of course, girls are much more interested in the social map, in relationships, in keeping up with who is on good terms with who. They're more interested in that than boys are. And so social media was a bright, shiny trap for girls. Once they all rush in 2012, that's when Instagram buys Facebook. That's when Facebook buys Instagram, and Instagram becomes extremely popular. It explodes in popularity in 2012. And so by 2013, most of the teen girls are on it. Well, once they're mostly on it, now they're trapped, because if anyone leaves, they're cut off. They don't know what the gossip is. They don't know who's dating who's fighting with who. So social media really trapped the girls. And with the girls, we see much sharper spikes. And in the United States, at least, it's like a hockey stick. There was no sign of a mental health problem all the way to 2011. No sign. Perfectly fine for the millennials. And then all of a sudden, 2012, 2013, the numbers go way, way up. So for girls, there's a lot of evidence that social media is really harming them. For boys, it certainly is harming many boys in specific ways, especially sextortion. They get contacted by a sexy girl. They send a photo of them and their face and their penis, and then the Nigerian sextortion ring, or wherever it's the big one is Nigeria, but they're all over the world. They say, now we've got you. We know all your contacts. So boys definitely are getting hurt by social media, but the evidence in published papers doesn't show the link as closely. For how do you trap a boy? Well, boys want two things: war and sex. Boys love to play at war. They will spontaneously form teams to compete. That's why we have, American football. That's why we have, lots of sports. It's really fun for boys. I remember the first time my friends and I played paintball when we were about 29 years old. About 8 of my buddies and I, we went into a place where you could play paintball in Charlottesville, Virginia. We shot we formed teams to shoot guns at each other, and it hurts when you get hit by a paint. It actually hurts, which is a big part of the thrill. So we're really hunting each other, and it was absolutely thrilling. We just loved it. So that's what boys want to do, and video games make it so easy to do that in a spectacular way. You don't get hurt at all. There's no setup. You just click on, you're on, you and your buddies, or you and strangers. So if you want to trap boys, you offer them war, fake war, or you offer them sex. And sex used to be really, really hard for boys to get. They had to learn, how do you talk to a girl? They're really hard to talk to if you're a boy with poor social skills. How do you flirt with a girl? How do you keep a girl's interest? How do you fall in love? How do you make the advance to sex? That was all really hard stuff. Boys don't have to do that anymore. They just go to Pornhub, say they're 18, and they can have the most erotic. Stuff is selected by other users to be the most erotic images humanly possible, for boys at least, not necessarily for girls. So anyway, it's the huge amount of time that boys are spending on video games and social and pornography, which in small amounts wouldn't necessarily be harmful at all. But when you're spending 3 or 4 hours a day on video games plus an hour or two a day on pornography every day for 10 years, that's going to, if you go through puberty doing that, it's going to affect neural development and social development and sexual development.
Now, usually when you get an American speaker in, people say, oh, well, that's America, that's not New Zealand. We've got American speakers here today, and they are very relevant to the New Zealand situation. And you yourself have looked specifically at what New Zealand stats are like. So what did you find out about New Zealand, and are there any difference between the New Zealand trends compared to UK, Canada, and the US?
Certainly. Let me look it up. So I would urge everyone listening, I hope you'll all sign up for my Substack. It's free. There's no paywall. But go to afterbabel.com. That's BABEL, afterbabel.com. And then we have all kinds of posts written by Zach Rausch, my lead researcher. He's the lead author. He and I wrote these. So here's one. The teen mental illness epidemic is international. Part 1, the Anglosphere. So we start off showing the well-known graphs about what happened in the USA with these hockey stick-shaped curves. And then we go on to Canada. We show the same thing, always looking at anxiety, depression, and self-harm in this post. We see the same thing in the UK. We see the same thing in Australia. And now let me go down and find the stuff for New Zealand. Here's what I can tell you. New Zealand. And we also have a whole Google Doc that with stuff about New Zealand. So we have a lot more than just this. Percent with an anxiety diagnosis, New Zealand. And what you see is that the line goes up. It's pretty flat for boys. And then it goes up beginning around 2012. You've had a 131% increase in boys with an anxiety diagnosis. This is ages 15 to 24 for this particular data set. 131% increase for your boys. For girls, 259% increase. So it's more than tripled. Let's see. Look at the next graph shows us percent with anxiety diagnosis, New Zealanders of all ages. What we can see is that your older people, they are up actually. So something either there are changing diagnostic criteria, either the standards are changing and everyone's up, or everyone's actually more anxious. But you see a huge difference between the younger people and the older people. So your older people are up something like 55% since 2011 in anxiety diagnosis. But your youngest group is up 330%. So however you look at it, whatever's happening, it's hitting the young people, it's especially hitting girls, and it's hitting New Zealanders just as much as it's hitting the rest of the Anglosphere. Depression, we see the same pattern. I think the most reliable thing to look at is hospital records about either psychiatric emergencies or self-harm, because this is not self-reported by the child. This is not reported by the parents. These are hospital records. And what we see this is from the Ministry of Health in New Zealand, from the ministry's national minimum data set. What we see is that public hospital discharges for intentional self-harm in New Zealand, for males aged 15 to 19, it's up 115% since 2010. So that's a very large increase. But for girls, it's up 138% and from a much higher baseline. So the graph is really quite dramatic. If people will go to afterbabble.com, you can see these graphs. So New Zealand has not been spared, even though your kids have better childhoods. I can't say that for sure. There's some, I don't know the rates of bullying and I don't know that. But in terms of having freedom and independence, New Zealand leads the Anglosphere. It's one of the best countries in the world. Would you agree with that, Bob? That in New Zealand, you might see an 8 or 9-year-old, you might see them riding bicycles around town. Would you see that in New Zealand?
It's getting less and less, unfortunately. And, whereas we used to have bike sheds at schools, now we have car parking spaces. So it is changing. And unfortunately, we do have one of the highest rates of bullying in schools, child abuse and family breakdown. So that's all contributing to it. But of course, one of the arguments, John, is that it was all COVID. It's because of COVID. It's because of lockdowns, and everybody's getting over that. How do you respond to that?
Look at the graphs. All of this started in the early 2010s. Sometimes you do see a big increase during COVID, especially for the girls. In the United States, there was a huge sex difference where girls really were freaked out by COVID. Girls wore masks. Girls followed all the rules, and boys less so. So we do see everything I'm saying started in the early 2010s, and it was almost all baked in by 2019. Then 2020 comes, and a lot of things get worse. And by 2022, 2023, they're getting better. But did they return to where they were 10 years ago? No, they returned to the trend line as if COVID never happened. So sure, COVID was very hard for many kids, but COVID did not cause these huge increases in 2012, 2013, beginning in 2012, 2013.
The argument, and I'm sure you've heard it a zillion times in all your media interviews this year, is correlation is not causation. How do you respond to that?
That's right. Of course, that's true. And so in all of my work, I've been very, very careful to distinguish which evidence is correlational, which evidence is experimental. A correlation just shows us that people who watch a lot of social media, who spend a lot of time consuming that, or video games, or anything, the heavy users of almost everything are doing worse than the light users or the non-users. And then some people say, oh, well, maybe it's because depressed people seek out social media. Maybe it's reverse correlation. So, okay, let's look at the experiments. I've collected about 25, looked for all the experiments. Some people have accused me of cherry picking, but I'm the only one who picks all the cherries. I find all the research on all sides, lay it out in Google Docs. If listeners go to anxiousgeneration.com/reviews, they can find all of my Google Docs. We lay out all the correlational studies, separate from the longitudinal studies, which give you a hint of causality, separate from the experiments, which do show causality, separate from the quasi-experiments, which also show causality. So I've been very, very careful, and I've marshaled a lot of evidence that it's causal. And then we can add to that the self-reports of all the people harmed by it. It's very hard to find young people who are grateful to social media. I can't find anybody writing about it, whereas those who say their lives were ruined, they're very, very numerous. And especially when you get things like a boy who commits suicide after being sextorted, is that just a correlation? Like, was he going to kill himself anyway if he hadn't been sextorted? I don't think so. So the fact that so many parents see the harm, so many of the older teens and kids in their 20s see the harm, and very few see the benefits. So I think that counts for something, that the young people themselves say they think this is damaging them.
Social media companies, with the word social in it, it almost sounds a positive, but we know that social media companies want to addict people into their product, just like big tobacco and big marijuana. And I was interested in the book where you talked about in 2010, there were some major changes where they introduced, to most people it's probably innocuous, but I can see what you're getting at. They introduced like and share and push notifications, and you've already alluded to the fact the cameras, which are so good.
Yeah.
What difference did that really make?
Mm-hmm. So humans are tribal creatures. We're very, very social. In fact, we're considered ultra social. We're much more social than chimpanzees or dogs. And throughout history, whenever you connect us more, it's generally a good thing. So the postal service was a good thing. Roads were a good thing. The telegraph, the telephone. Now, each brings disruption. There's always disruption. But at the time and afterwards, it's generally thought like, wow, this is amazing. I can just call someone up on the other side of the country. This is incredible. And when the internet came in, it was like that. It was like, wait, you mean I just type in a question, I get the answer? Like it was like God came down and said, do you want omniscience? Here you go, the internet. So the early internet was miraculous. We all loved it. Yes, some bad stuff happened, but the good has been overwhelming. Nobody wants to ban the internet practically. The early smartphone was the same. It was a miracle. It was a digital Swiss Army knife. I still love my iPhone because it's full of tools that I use when I want to do something. It's a tool for me. And that's the way it was until 2008. But in 2009, also social media, early Facebook, also that sort of, Friendster, MySpace, they were amazing. Like, you mean I can just like put stuff up and my friends can see it? Like, I don't have to email them individual photographs. This is great.
Yeah.
But those early companies didn't make any money. They didn't have a business model. Facebook pioneered the advertising-driven model, where the user is not a customer. The user is the product to be delivered to the advertiser, who is the customer. So you want to get as much product as you can, and you have to grow as fast as you can so that all the product comes to you rather than going to 10 other different networks. So Facebook pioneers that. And 2009 is the pivotal year. That's when Facebook introduces the like button and Twitter introduces the retweet button. And then both platforms copy each other's innovations, and then everybody copies both. So almost all social media platforms you can like and share. Well, this changes the fundamental parameters of the internet. This means rather than, you could make something go viral in the old days if you send out an email chain and your Uncle Bill forwards this thing to 30 people. You could, but it took a while. With like and share buttons, something can go viral in one day. It can be all over the world in one day. It just makes things much more exciting, much more contagious. It amplifies the mob dynamic. So that's when we get cancel culture. It doesn't come in right away in 2009, but cancel culture could not have happened without the like and share and retweet buttons. And then, as you mentioned, we get push notifications. So the early iPhone this was a tool. It was not my master, it was my tool. But once you get the App Store and push notifications, now it's a portal through which millions of companies, literally millions of companies, are competing with each other to get on your phone. Once they're on their phone, they can send you notifications. The young people do not turn off their notifications. They just get hundreds and hundreds of notifications every day. They get interrupted every few minutes. So that's when things really get bad. Is the early 2010s. In 2010, we were still all super optimistic about the internet and social media. In 2011, the Arab Spring, we think, wow, social media is going to knock down dictators. We love our iPhones. We love social media. It's really powerful stuff. We all get to express ourselves. So all the way to 2011, we thought things were good. And our kids desperately wanted our phones, our iPads. The iPad comes out around then. And we give it to them. So, we didn't know that this stuff was going to be harmful. We thought it was magical. And it turns out now it harms our kids in a lot of different ways. The main one being just that it pushes out everything else. If our kids are spending, between 6 and 10 hours, the estimates are usually between 6 and 10 hours outside of school, 6 and 10 hours a day on their screens, in America, at least in Britain, that pushes out almost everything else.
Which sort of leads into the question, is it the screen that's the problem, the amount of time on the screen, or is it the social media, or is it both?
Well, it's all of them. The sheer amount of time on screen. So suppose your kids were watching nature documentaries for 9 hours a day. How bad is that? Well, if it's causing them to sleep less, see their friends less, go outside less, get less sunshine, get less exercise, I would say 9 hours a day of nature documentaries is harmful, even though an hour or two a day would be good. So there's what's called the opportunity cost. 9 hours a day of anything is really bad for your kids. But then there's so much more. Then there's the addictive nature, because nature documentaries are not designed to be addictive. They're not designed to keep you watching nature documentaries all day long. But social media is carefully engineered by people who studied the gambling industry. They literally studied casinos. When you pull down to refresh, it kind of bounces up. And that was directly copied on the slot machine. You pull down the handle on the slot machine and the wheels spin around, directly modeled on gambling addiction. So there's the addictive content. For girls especially, there's the sexual predation. We had an article on After Babel by Arturo Bejar, who was a safety researcher at Meta for many years at Facebook. And when his own daughter, 13, 14, got on Instagram, and she was getting solicitations from men that were inappropriate, and she was getting a lot of them, and there was no way for her to report them because they weren't harassing. It wasn't like they were explicitly sexual, but it was clear they were trying to pick her up, and there was no way to report it. And Arturo did some research on it. He found that 15% of girls in that age range get solicited every week on Instagram. It's just constant. So there's so many different ways in which a phone-based childhood exposes kids to harms. Boys and girls have a different set of harms to some extent. So it's all of it. It's the sheer amount of time, and it's the specific things they're doing.
Some people would argue that it's good that mental illness is top of mind, I guess, pardon the pun, that we are recognising it. The stigma has gone. Although I note in May, the New York Times published a piece headed, "Are we talking too much about mental health?" And they said mental health awareness campaigns help some young people identify disorders that badly need treatment, but they can have a negative effect on others, leading them to over-interpret the symptoms and see themselves as more troubled than they are. And they also, interestingly, quoted some research on mindfulness and said that mindfulness training could improve students' mental health, but students at highest risk for mental health problems did somewhat worse after receiving the training. So are we talking too much about it?
Definitely. I think I shouldn't say that. I believe that we are, yes. And so the argument about reducing stigma, it sounds good on the surface. And some of my critics have said, well, the numbers are going up just because we're more tolerant now. This is a good thing that we're diagnosing it. I don't believe that for a second. The reason is that when I was a kid in the 70s, it was shameful. My mother sent me to a therapist for a few months, and I was very embarrassed. I mean, there was a real stigma in the 1970s and before. But in the 80s and 90s, that stigma started going down and down and down. And by 2010, the stigma is largely gone. And so stigma's going down and down and down. And what happens to mental health stats? Nothing. They stay flat. They're not going up or down. So the stigma was largely gone, I'd say, by 2010. And then once all the girls get on Instagram, girls are more subject to emotional contagion. They pick up each other's emotions much more than boys do. Boys are more clueless. They are literally more autistic, more on the spectrum than girls are. That's part of the definition of what happens to our brains. In any case, my point is, if the stigma thing was really important here, we would see gradually rising rates of mental illness from the 90s through the present, and we don't see that. We see flat or even slightly declining rates until 2010, 2011, 2012, and then they go up very suddenly. That wouldn't be because of declining stigma. Rather, if it was just that suddenly there were all these resources by which teens could talk to a psychiatrist and get a diagnosis, well, that would be great. Okay, that would be fantastic. That's not what happened. What happened is, let's hook everyone up with groups such as Pinterest that allow you to have networks, not based on who you know, but on what you're interested in. Oh, you're a little bit anxious? Oh, you're concerned about your weight? Here's a group for you in which other girls will talk about their anxiety and their eating disorders. And the ones who are most extreme will get the most likes and followers. And that will automatically set your brain to copy them. So I think putting girls into communities of other girls who are talking about mental illness is generally a very bad thing. We should not be doing this to our daughters. I know of no evidence that this is helpful to them. Even if they say they find support, they're picking up each other's emotions. And I think this is a large reason why it's the girls who get so sick so quickly after they get on Instagram. It doesn't do that to the boys.
Okay, I want to we're running out of time, but just look at your solutions. But just one more quick question. In chapter 8 of your book, you talk on spiritual elevation and degradation, and you say the phone-based life produces spiritual degradation, not just in adolescence, but in all of us. And you also talk about social media bringing out the worst in us, which I agree with, and we lose sight of friendship with others. And you quote Psalm 91 about seeing the beauty of God's creation around us. Does faith and religion, you have alluded to this earlier on, right at the start actually, does faith and religion have a protective effect? Does the traditional family structure have an effect?
Oh, yes, they both do. So here, look. So I'm writing. So I'm Jewish. I was raised Jewish, but in a very secular family. For a while, I was anti-religion when I read the Hebrew Bible, and took it literally. I thought, oh, I don't like religion. I could have been a new atheist like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins. But because I was studying morality and moral psychology, I took religion very seriously as a part of our evolution, part of our history. You can't separate it from the history of societies. And in reviewing psychological research in my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis, it was very clear when you look at who's happy, it's the people who are bound in and connected. So the two big things in positive psychology are marriage and religion. People who are married are much happier than people who are not. People who are religious, which means especially go to church or something every week. It's the participation, it's the community. Those people have always been happier than people who don't. So that's been true for a long time. When we look at the data on teenagers and we separate the data by secular versus versus religious, and also, or if we do it liberal versus conservative or left-right, what we see, because it was also known, liberals are a little less happy than conservatives. They're a little bit more creative, but they're a little more neurotic and anxious. They're well-known facts in political psychology. So there's always been a happiness difference, but it wasn't huge until about 2012. Then what we see is the lines for, let's say, conservative religious boys go up hardly at all. They get a little bit more anxious and depressed. But the line for secular liberal girls goes up a lot. So what we see, again, this is Emil Durkheim, the sociologist, the more you are rooted in a strong community that gives you a moral universe with ideas of right and wrong, and people who will be there a year from now, they'll be here 10 years from now, they're your community, and they have expectations of you, and you have duties and obligations. If that's the way you are when you're hitting puberty, even if you're on social media an hour a day, it's not going to wash you out to sea. Whereas if you don't have any of that stuff and your parents give you a smartphone and you're spending 5 hours a day just on Instagram and TikTok and 10 hours a day on your screen, you are probably, and you're a girl, you are probably going to have an anxiety disorder.
Okay, I don't think we need to persuade anybody that you have identified a real issue. Solutions. What are your 4 solutions?
So the key to solving this is to recognize the key to the origin of the problem, which is a collective action problem. Why are all the kids on Instagram and TikTok, even when they themselves say, if you talk to college students, they say it's really bad for me, it's bad for us, I wish it didn't exist. They literally say that, and surveys show that. So why are they all on it? Because they're trapped, because it's a collective action problem. And so anybody who gets pulled out, if you take your kids out of it, it's not clear you're helping them because now they're isolated, they're alone, and they're going to hate you. And but what that means is that if we take them all out together, we win. And so we have to do this together. We have to do this as a collective action solution. And it can be as local as you, if you're listening to this, our discussion here, if you have, say, 9-year-old kids and you're in touch with the friends, the parents of their friends, just coordinate with them. Because if you do these things together, we can solve this. So the first is no smartphone before high school. In the United States, we have a clear divide around age 13, 14. So we need to just get smartphones out of middle school, delay them until high school, which is around age 14. Now, just tell me, in New Zealand, do you do the British system where you have secondary school beginning around like 11 or 12?
No, that's intermediate school, and then high school starts at about 13 or 14.
Oh, good. So you have the same as us. All right. So in New Zealand, I would say, follow this rule: no smartphone before high school. Give them a flip phone. Give them a phone watch. Don't give them the internet in their pocket before 14, before the end of middle school. That's the first rule. Second rule: no social media till 16. Social media is completely inappropriate for minors. It's an adult-only thing. It's full of sex and violence. It's full of solicitation. It's full of marketing. It's full of real dangers for kids, all kinds of scams, manipulation. So, adults, we let them make their own decisions. And if they want to do things that are bad for them, that's their choice. But for God's sakes, I don't want to let companies just reach my children and do things that are bad for my children without my knowledge or permission.
Yeah.
This is insane. So no social media before 16. And for that, it would be really helpful to have laws. I'm trying to do this just with norms. Like, we can actually get this done mostly just with norms, not laws. But on this point, getting legislation, which is happening in Florida, in Utah, it's happening in the UK. Is working on this too. If we can get legislation to say you can't even open an account until you're 16. The law currently says 13, and it's not enforced. Why not raise it to 16 and enforce it? So that's the second rule: no social media before 16. The third rule is the easiest. The third norm is the easiest of all. We can get it done this year. It's phone-free schools. It's complete insanity to let kids have a phone in their pocket during school. Most schools say you're not allowed to use your phone during class, which is like saying to heroin addicts, you can bring your needles into the clinic, you can bring your stash in, but just keep it in your pocket. Just don't take it out and everything will be okay. They can't. They have to take it out. They have to be texting during class. They have to be watching TikTok during class. So the only solution is lock up the phones in the morning when they come to school in a phone locker or a yonder pouch, a lockable pouch.
Okay, the good news is that the new government, which just came in, John, has actually, one of their policy planks was that they would ban phones in schools. And
I just heard that.
Yeah, so that's a tick on that one. Although, I mean, the question that I want to ask you is, why did it take politicians to do this and not the so-called professional educators and principals to be calling for this?
No, the reason is because, at least I don't know about New Zealand, but in America, parents are so overprotective that if you lock up the phones, a number of them, a minority, but a lot of them, would freak out.
Yeah.
Say, what? You mean I can't text my child during the day? Like, I can't. Yeah. What if something goes wrong? What if my child's afraid? I have to be there for my child. And then in America, we have the argument, what if there's a school shooter? To which I say, okay, so would you rather have all the kids on their phones yelling and screaming and crying? Or would you rather have the kids following directions, doing what they're supposed to do in such an emergency? In any case, the teachers all hate the phones. The headmasters, the principals, they all hate the phones. They all hate them. I mean, it makes their jobs impossible. So they all hate it. But because of parental objections, they couldn't. So what I'm urging is, parents, if you're listening to me, contact the head of your kid's school. Plead with them, urge them, demand that they lock up the phones. Otherwise, your kid is not going to get a full education. And we are, in fact, seeing educational attainment dropping around the world since 2012, around the world, according to the PISA data set. Yeah, including New Zealand. That's right.
Yeah. Okay, and number 4?
Oh, and the fourth. Wait, the fourth one, yes. The fourth is the hardest because it's the one where we have to give up something, not our kids. It's more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. It means we have to overcome our fears and let our kids out and let them hang out with other kids with no adult supervising. What if there's a fight? What if there's an argument? What if there are hurt feelings? Yeah, that would be actually good. They need that. So again, it may not be as much of a change in New Zealand, but as you said, like, you're following us in all the bad trends. So don't follow us. Look at what we did and just never do what we did, because we really got this wrong.
John, just finally, I mean, mea culpa, I think as adults, we set a really bad example for our children because, probably right now, there's people in the audience who are checking a notification. We struggle with it ourselves. And I'm also always mindful of the fact that probably I've set a bad example for the kids in terms of my use. So we need to lead this whole change, don't we? Because adults have also been drawn into this and addicted to phones.
Well, that would be nice, but I don't know how powerful it is. So if we could have, if God came to us and said, you can have either curtain 1 or curtain 2. Behind curtain 1, all the adults will have perfect phone manners. They'll have total control. And behind curtain number 2, we raise the age to 16 for social media and we enforce it. Which do you want? I'm going for curtain number 2. Teenagers are not copying their parents. If I start reading The Economist magazine, my 14-year-old daughter is not going to look at me and say, oh, I want to start reading The Economist magazine. She doesn't care what I do. She's not copying me. She's completely focused on what the kids on her track team and she's completely focused on what they think about her shoes, her hair, everything else. That's what matters. They're not copying us.
John, it's been fantastic discussion. Just finally, what's been the response to your book? I mean, I have been following it, and I have seen that actually there has been moves like in the UK with age verification. There's been an important discussion happening in Australia. I'm hoping that our chat today will start a discussion in New Zealand. But like I say, we can tick number 3 of your solutions because of the new government. What has been the general response?
Yeah. The response has been unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. I've been involved with many efforts to persuade people of things, beginning with gun control in the United States in the 1980s, with, making arguments for Democrats on policies. It's very hard to change people's minds, very hard to persuade them. This time around, everyone, if you're a parent or a teacher or a child psychologist, you've seen the problem. You've seen it up close. You were in a state of despair. You thought that there was nothing we could do. And suddenly my book comes along and says, you know what? You're not crazy. Like, this really is happening. And guess what? If we work together, we can actually get out of it. And so the response has been overwhelming. I've never seen anything like it. Parents are spontaneously getting together. They're saying, hey, did you read this book? Yeah, I read it. Oh, let's do that stuff together. Yeah, let's do it together. And they're going to their schools and they're sending copies of the book to the headmasters of schools. And the headmasters are saying, yeah, let's do this. So I think this is going to be a social revolution unlike any we've seen because it's happening in the social media age. And of course, that's what drove us into the pit. But if we turn things around, it's what can take us out very quickly. Collective action, driven in part on social media. I'm very happy to use social media as an adult to advance my goals and to advance this movement.
Well, congratulations on the book, John. I first heard about it at the ARC conference in London when you spoke there. And I just thought to myself, gosh, we've got to get John speaking in New Zealand. So we really thank you for being part of Forum on the Family 2024. And if you do make it to New Zealand next year, we'll show you some of the beauties of New Zealand and we'll try and find some kids climbing trees. Hopefully there'll be an increase in the number of them.
I hope they won't be extinct by then. Yeah.
But all the
Very
best,
good.
John,
Thank
and
you.
thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks to you and your organization.